Let's go now to Ella Atkins. She's a professor of aerospace and ocean engineering at Virginia Tech. Ella, thank you so much for joining us. The first question is, how unusual is it for something like this to happen?
It's almost unheard of to have a plane land upside down with their gear in the air and have everyone get out alive. That is remarkable, and I'm very happy to be saying that everyone lived to tell the stories of this in many years to come. In terms of having an accident on landing, while it's extremely unusual for a commercial transport aircraft to have an accident on landing, and I want to echo that flying today is safe and no one should hesitate to go to the airport and catch their next flight. Landing is the most dangerous phase of flight. In this particular case, the aircraft appeared to have taken off normally, followed a normal flight route, communicated with air traffic control, and been lined up perfectly with the runway. So everyone was very surprised when something happened.
Yeah, and I had no idea how dangerous landing could be until you mentioned that. And I think I have to ask here, because we know the investigation is still ongoing as we speak, and we don't want to speculate. But we do see the snow out there in that video, and we could also see what looks like wind, too, just blowing snow. Do you think that may have contributed to this crash?
At this time, there's no reason to believe that the plane skidded because of snow on the runway. The runway was cleared and open. Other aircraft had not had trouble with it. So the plane appeared to touch down in a way that did not suggest the snow impeded its landing ability.
So as pilots, we're trained to perform a maneuver called a flare, where we pull up at the last second. If we pull up too hard, the nose will go too high and will float down the runway, or we might even start ascending again. But if we don't pull up enough, the plane will keep descending far too fast and slam into the ground. In the video, you can see that the plane doesn't appear to flare, but why might that be? Let's start by looking at the GPS data, and specifically the ground speed of the airplane. Just before landing, the ADS-B track shows the plane is doing around 118 knots over the ground. That's below the VREF, or the typical landing speed for this airplane. If the plane was flying too slow, that would mean the wings have stalled and the pilot might not have even been able to pull up. But the devil is in the details. You might remember from the ATC tapes from yesterday that the winds were strong and gusting.
Tower, 4819, I'm sorry. That was 23. 4819, Tower, with 27023, gust 33, clear to line on 823, when you get a slight bump in the glide path, there'll be an aircraft in front of it.
The winds were gusting 23 to 33, and that ADS-B data is only ground speed, not airspeed. To get a more accurate view of the airspeed, and subsequently the speed that the plane would stall at, we need to add that wind component. If we calculate out the crosswind component, that gives us about 20 to 25 knots of headwind, or if we add that to our ground speed, it gives us around 140 knots. That's actually a really good approach speed for the CRJ 900.
Okay, and do you think this incident could trigger any regulation changes in the future?
I don't think so. I think the main thing that we should be looking at here is that pilots always need to be vigilant every last second, especially on landing, all the way until the plane comes to a stop. The winds always need to be taken into consideration. If there are any unusual circumstances, it's safer to go around, even though passengers may be alarmed by this notion of throttling up and going around and trying again. That gives you a chance to be more stable next time around. I think the third thing that I want to say here is that the CRJs are extremely safe airplanes, regardless of the fact that there were two incidents. There's no reason to believe that the CRJ as an aircraft is flawed. They fly safely every day. And the one thing I want to point out is that they are a slightly older aircraft in some cases. They do not have auto-land systems. The auto-land system in this case could have at least made sure that the airplane was landing straight on center line at the right descent rate. And so that is a technology that should be considered as valuable for all commercial transport aircraft moving forward.
To hit hard enough to damage the airplane is extremely unusual. I mean, you would be very uncomfortable and the airplane would be fine. As long as you hit on those main gear first, and it does appear to be a main gear landing, the gear is designed to take that kind of abuse. You can make no flare, it should not hurt the airplane. So after that, what happened after that, either something broke, landing gear, tire blew, or landing gear, or we banked the airplane too much and the wingtip hit the ground. Or a combination of those could have happened.
We can cross-reference this with the granular data that Flight Radar 24 has published this morning. Most flight tracking websites only publish a subset of the data that ADS-B actually broadcasts. That's because to track an airplane, you only need its location and altitude, and that's good enough for most people who just want to see where a plane is. Sending more data than people need to see just costs more bandwidth and hurts website responsiveness. But for these big accidents, Flight Radar 24 also publishes the raw, granular ADS-B data. From this granular data, we can see that ADS-B was publishing the true airspeed of the airplane. In the seconds before the accident, we can see that the plane is flying at 146 knots. This plane was still flying. But one really interesting piece of the data is the plane's vertical speed. The granular data gives us the plane's actual vertical speed and not a calculated vertical speed. We can see that on approach, the plane is descending at around 600 feet per minute, but in the final 5 seconds, the plane drops out from underneath them and descends at over 1,000 feet per minute. But that then begs the question, were they hit with a sudden downdraft, and what would have caused that?
Everything seems perfectly normal until maybe the last 30 feet when you would typically flare a little bit, the nose would come up to reduce the rate of descent on landing. And that doesn't appear to happen. It doesn't appear that the flare is sufficient. I'm not sure there was, I can't say there was no flare, but there wasn't enough flare, okay? A pilot can put that right wing down a little bit in order to counter that drift. But when the wind is this strong, you can't put it down enough. Eventually, the wingtip depends on the airplane, the wingtip or the engine would strike the ground. So you can only put it down a little bit, and the rest of it has to be done at the last minute, where you push the rudder, in this case the left rudder, to straighten the airplane down the runway. So our video doesn't really show the alignment like that, but it does show the right wing down, which is normal, and it explains why the right gear hits first, and also perhaps why the right wing would hit next, and it appears it did hit, and maybe pretty hard. Wings are just bolted onto the airplanes. If you hit the ground hard enough, you can break the wing off, or at least a portion of it.
We know that they followed in another plane, a Challenger 650, which is a small private jet.
We get a slight bump in the glide path, there'll be an aircraft in front of it.
But the Challenger aircraft aren't known for producing heavy wake turbulence, and the two aircraft had over 1.5 minutes worth of spacing. With a strong crosswind, that means any wake turbulence most likely would have been completely dissipated. Some people have suggested the plane landed without flaps, but you can definitely see the slats in the video, and sometimes at this angle, the flaps are a little bit more difficult to see. It's going to be most interesting to see what the pilot's control inputs were, and any granular weather information that the Transportation Safety Board can produce.
Design and strength of the airplane and the seats are key in the survivability of it. But in this case, what really hurts people is the sudden stop. So we're on a large, smooth piece of concrete. We have that initial impact, which isn't too bad, maybe enough to break the airplane, but it doesn't stop the airplane's forward motion. So it's sliding down the runway, and that's why everybody survived. We had a relatively controlled deceleration. Everybody didn't stop all at once, and they all lived, and most of them were uninjured. Crashing on an airport is, if you have to crash, it's a good place to crash.
Looking at the preliminary data, it looks like the initial approach was fairly well stabilized. I believe, I'm going to go crunch the numbers and check them really closely now, but it looks like everything was within limits as far as speed, rate of descent, crosswind limits, the weather that they were facing. But just the very last moment there, it appears that the aircraft simply did not flare at all. They just drove it into the runway.
You can see here, the fuselage came to rest slightly off the right side of the runway, upside down, facing the other direction. Other duties we'll be conducting here on site are examining the wreckage, examining the runway. We've already removed the cockpit voice recorder, the flight data recorder, and we've sent them to our lab for further analysis.
And to help us break down what happened during this dramatic crash, let's turn to aviation journalist Mark Miller. Mark, you were a key part of our coverage yesterday. Thank you for that, and thank you for coming back today. Amazing. I know you've covered so many crashes. To hear from someone who was inside the plane as it happened a day after.
Yeah, I mean, he's going to provide lots of information. All the people that were on that airplane, including the flight crew that were at the front of the airplane operating it. That's a treasure trove of information. The fact that the airplane did not break up, I mean, look at that thing, that did not break up as it sort of spun around down that runway. None of that fire went inside the airplane. We saw the big fireball. We didn't know about that last night, really, until we started to see those videos.
Yeah.
So it's remarkable. Had that fire got inside, people would have been hurt, maybe killed. We may have had a much bigger fire inside that airplane.
Once that right wing broke, the left wing, of course, is still producing lift, so the aircraft is going to roll. It lifts the wing vertically like a large sail, and I assume until the vertical tail fails, and then the wing continues to lift until they're upside down. You know what it's like driving in that blowing snow, with that snow crossing the runway, that dry snow? It's kind of hypnotizing. If you let that distract you for just a moment in the landing phase right there as it comes time to flare, and if you delay that flare, you could end up pile driving that thing right on the runway. Good work on behalf of all those crew members and the initial responders, the ARFF crews, for getting that fire stopped. That was vital.
Let's look at the footage. There's been so many angles of the actual crash itself, and this relatively new. As you see that, Mark, what goes through your mind?
Well, we were trying to figure out what this approach was like all night, and then this video came out this morning, and you can see as the airplane comes in, it does look like a stable approach. It looks pretty normal. And but we don't see, as that airplane gets over the runway, is we do not see him flare. We don't see him raise that nose. He just basically flew it in.
So you're not only an aviation journalist, you're a pilot.
Yep.
So you would normally expect to see a pilot pull the nose up as they're about to
So
land?
just watch this. You see he's almost parallel with the ground. We would normally see that nose come up, 10, 15 degrees. It doesn't happen. So that put all the energy into that one landing gear. And you can see the wing just sort of tilts off to the right. I think he was coming in. He was crabbing into the wind. So he was sort of slipping down the flight, down the approach. And at the last second, he straightens it out, but he has to dip his wing. And for whatever reason, he didn't raise the nose.
Let's just show it. So you see it coming in for a landing. It's obviously a snowy day. The runway has snow. And it's a huge jet. When I heard regional jet, I thought small. No, it's a huge jet. And fire when the wheels touch down, or so it looks, followed by a cloud of black smoke. It's very clear. I don't know why this guy was filming this particular landing, but man, he got the whole thing. It went on its side, it then flipped upside down, and somehow everyone survived. So Wiz, how does this happen?
Well, Megan, thanks for having me back again. Sadly, under these circumstances, or actually since everybody got out, I guess we're okay. Megan, the first thing, when I saw the in-cockpit video this morning, I heard you reading your email in the last block there, then I guess I can talk like this. That jet was coming down like a turd off a tall moose. Landing an F-18 aboard an aircraft carrier, our average rate of descent is about 800 feet per minute. And I think the last flight tracker data that I saw for this RJ was about 1,100 feet per minute. So that RJ came down a lot faster and harder than I would have landed aboard the boat. And I think, one of the officials yesterday or last night said, hey, crosswind wasn't an issue. Whenever anything like this happens, Megan, I grab my aviation app and I immediately look at the weather, see what the weather is. And landing on runway 23, the winds were out at 270, so about 40 degrees off the nose or down the runway in really gusty conditions. So it looks like this airplane didn't really have too much of a flare, which is when you get close into the runway, we pull the nose back, pull back on the throttles and kind of do that nice, what we as Navy pilots would say, Air Force landing. But this landing was hard, and it looks like it sheared off the right main landing gear, took the wing with it, and then the only wing that was left, the left wing, still producing lift, they kind of corkscrew and roll down the runway. But my God, we jokingly in aviation say any landing we can walk away from is a good landing. That was a pretty bad landing, and thank God a lot of people walked away.
And so early on, there were questions about the crosswinds, which were up to 25, 35 knots, I think?
Yep.
Yeah. And so we talked to a pilot yesterday who said that those winds by themselves didn't raise a red flag for him. We don't know if the runway was slippery or not. We know there was a notice to Aviators saying that there were sections of the runway that were slippery. Would either of those two things, the potential for winds, the potential for a slippery runway, explain why this plane didn't flare just before it landed?
So there is one theory, and I don't know what the operating procedures or techniques trained for these pilots are at this airline. But there are some airlines where they ask you to make a positive landing. So if it's wet or the runway is slippery, you want to really kind of plant the airplane on there in a solid way. So that might explain why there isn't a big flare at the end. But there shouldn't still be that kind of descent rate where it's going to rip the landing gear off. All that weight went onto that one landing gear, which is actually attached to a really strong part of the wing, and then the wing comes off. There's no way you should be coming down with that kind of a descent rate. Everybody who looks at this in aviation is asking the same question. Why is he hitting the ground with such a high vertical speed?
I always like to tell myself, as somebody who used to fly out of O'Hare all the time in very snowy, bad conditions, they wouldn't let the plane take off if this weren't safe to fly in. So should they not have been flying planes in this kind of wind?
No, these winds, as Wiz will tell you, are winds that pilots are trained to handle. There are certain limitations, not only with the aircraft, but the airline sets a policy about wind conditions as well. But when you look at this landing in the video, that aircraft was coming down at a high rate of descent. You typically will go into a flare and arrest that descent so that when you touch down, your rate of descent is maybe 100 to 200 feet a minute rather than 1,100. The nominal is about 500 to 700 feet per minute. So
wait, just put that in layman's terms. You're saying it was coming down faster than it should have been?
Absolutely, almost double, almost twice as fast as it should have been. And again, that's the problem, is you saw the right wing drop just before the airplane touched down on the runway. That's what took all that high energy impact, was that right main landing gear, the wing. That's what snapped it off. And as Wiz said, the left wing was still producing lift, which rolled that airplane and got it sliding sideways. I'm going to be interested to know from the flight data recorder not only what the G trace, that's the G impact, because it's a recorded parameter, how many G forces were experienced on that landing, but to determine whether or not the actual nose of the airplane was cocked off center. A lot of times in these crosswinds, and there were crosswinds, they were gusty crosswinds, and as Wiz knows, when you're flying, you'll typically add a gust factor. You'll actually increase your speed by half the gust factor to give you more controllability. All of these things are going to have to be dissected by the investigators to see what kind of flying and who was flying at the time of the accident.
Let's talk about a procedural issue that you identified. Interesting, because you have been covering so many aviation incidents over so many years, and that is, I think you told us this is the first U.S. registered passenger plane that the TSB, the Transportation Safety Board in Canada, is investigating. So it sounds kind of nerdy, Mark. What's the significance of that?
Well, the last time an American registered passenger plane crashed in Canada was 1985, Gander, Newfoundland. It was an American military charter. And in fact, that accident triggered the sort of the closure of the Canadian Aviation Safety Board, and it was replaced by the Transportation Safety Board. I think it was Safety Bureau it was called. Anyway, and that happened because there was pressure from the Americans as to what the results of the Canadian investigation was. So the question people are asking now is, Canadian investigators, American airplane, will there be any pressure from the Americans on this? Last time this happened, there was, and we lost our investigating body. Now I'm told we have a much more robust investigating body. That can't happen again. All indications are everybody's professional. I've worked with the National Transportation Safety Board before on shows. I think it'll be fine, but it's just something to keep your eye on.
Yeah, I mean, I've also talked to lots of their investigators. They do seem to be independent, do a very good job. And of course, that crash you're talking about in Newfoundland and Labrador involved American servicemen, right?
That's
so
right.
Probably like higher kind of political issues or concerns at that time. One last thing I want to ask you about. You know, we're both journalists. We both have an interest in getting information out as quickly as possible and accurately as possible. The Greater Toronto Airport Authority in their news conferences have said very little. Yesterday, answering no questions. Even to this point tonight, we haven't gotten a lot of information from them.
I don't think that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
Because I'm not sure that the airport authority, whether it's in Vancouver or in Toronto, I'm not sure they actually know, what the issues here are. One of the things that investigators are going to look at, it's those winds, weather. And somebody said to me, Mark, when you're landing on runway 23, look to the right. There's a giant Air Canada hangar, a series of other hangars. And as that air comes over, it starts to get turbulent and burble. So we know that the ride down wasn't too bad because people didn't talk about turbulence, but something happened right at the end where things became more dynamic and something went wrong. So was it the air coming across the runway? I don't think that the airport authority knows those kinds of things. I know we've asked those questions, but I don't see how runway clearing, snow clearing has anything to do with this. This looks like an environmental issue, maybe an operational issue, and the investigators will get at that.
But just to clarify what you're saying, so they say weather's not an issue, but you're saying you have questions about that based on the data that you saw.
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, whether if they're talking about clouds or low ceilings or anything like that, just because the sun is out doesn't mean the weather is great. Very, very gusty conditions. When I looked at my phone after the mishap, it was 25 gusts, 45 knots, which is absolutely significant. That's some sporty wind conditions. If it's right down the runway, right on the nose, it's fine. Still a little sporty. But if it's 40 degrees off, you're kind of crabbing into the wind and having to take that crab out at the last second. Very, very sporty conditions. So
sporty.
Yeah,
what a word.
Or varsity or JV, however you want to word it. It was definitely not pleasant condition.
There are just too many possible variables. But as a meteorologist and a private pilot, let me tell you, we are always thinking about weather and managing variables, especially during those last few minutes before landing. Here's what we know about the weather conditions at the time. We have meteorological data from Pearson Airport 12 minutes before the crash. This is a METAR, short for Meteorological Aerodrome Report, used mainly by meteorologists and pilots for current observations of the weather. It says winds were coming from the west, steady at 52 kilometers per hour, gusting to 65 kilometers per hour, with reports of blowing snow, but fairly good visibility. We also know the plane was landing on runway 23. Runway numbers line up with compass degrees, so 230 is landing towards the southwest. So we always try to land into the wind. It slows the plane down faster, and in a controlled busy airport like Pearson, the tower is going to pick what runways are closest to landing straight into the wind and let all the planes know. In this case, there were a couple of active runways. The closest Delta could get to landing straight into the wind was runway 23, but that meant winds were coming at them from a 40-degree angle from the right. When coming in to land with winds that are blowing from a direction that is not directly head-on, that's called a crosswind landing. And there are a couple different ways as a pilot you can account for that. You can crab or angle your nose towards the wind a little so you don't get blown off course. So the plane is lined up with the runway even if the nose isn't. You can side slip by putting one wing a little lower into the wind to keep you in line. And to keep the plane from turning, you also have to engage the tail controls, the rudder, in an opposite direction. In both cases, this means some juggling of the control surfaces while landing and ultimately straightening the plane out in those final moments before touchdown. It's something the pilots do all the time. Different aircraft have different wind and wind angle limits that manufacturers and airlines recommend landing in. That's because you don't want to put too much strain on the landing gear if the plane ends up touching down a little sideways. The standard crosswind procedure in this type of plane, the CRJ 900, is to crab into the crosswind and to decrab just before touchdown.
Now, Wiz, this is, okay, I'm told that this is a CRJ 900 configured with seats for 70 to 76 passengers. It looks huge. It doesn't look like one of those small regional jets, God rest them, like the folks who went down from Kansas into DC, the last time we were talking to you. It looks larger to me, but I know you did mention then, and I've read in connection with this, that those regional pilots are not quite as trained as the, big old American Airlines jet pilots that we have on the, DC-10s or 747s that we fly.
Well, let me rephrase that or clean that up a little bit. They're certainly trained, right? The FAA has standards. You have to meet these minimum standards. Endeavor Air has standards. So clearly, those two aviators sitting in front of that regional jet had met the standards, the minimum standards. I think what the nuance is experience. That's probably, I'll clean it up by saying experience. Mm-hmm. Not to talk down to any folks in the regional jet. I wasn't born the world's best fighter pilot, or actually I was. But you're not born. You're not born with thousands and thousands of flight hours, right? You got to get your hours somewhere. So a lot of the folks in the regionals are doing their time, right? They're building their hours. I don't know too many folks who make flying in the regionals a career. They want to fleet up, so to to speak, to the main line, to Delta, United, FedEx, where the big money is. So a lot of these regional jet crews are overworked and definitely underpaid, in my opinion. But they have got to meet the minimum requirements.
Like,
They have
would
to do
you
their annual
fly?
check
Would
run.
you fly as a passenger on a regional jet?
I would, Megan.
What actually happened, we don't know. We do know that based on flight tracking details from flight radar, this plane's final descent rate was quite fast. A normal descent rate is about 400 feet per minute, and in this case, it was around 1,000 feet per minute, more than twice as fast. The rate of descent caught my eye because this plays into what we call the flaring. This is a maneuver that every pilot does in the last few seconds. By gently pulling the nose back, you slow down the rate of descent, the plane's main wheels touch down first, and you generally get a softer landing. But the faster the descent, the harder it is to pull this off. There's one more piece of information that we have that investigators will be looking at, and that's the state of the runway. Was it icy? Was it snowy? Remember, Toronto had just been hit by a massive snowstorm the day before. A notice was issued to all flight personnel in the area that same day, what we call a NOTAM, giving details about the state of the runway given the recent snow and gusting winds. Runway 23 was complicated. Most of the cleared portion of the runway was a combo of dry snow patches and dry compacted snow patches. But the runway was not cleared all the way to the edges. Normally, this is a 200-foot wide runway, but only a 160-foot wide path was cleared. On either side, it would have looked white. So approaching this runway would have looked narrower or farther away than it normally would be fully cleared. But again, we can't say if this was a factor. Ultimately, we can't say if any of these weather conditions were a factor in what happened. But as investigators from the Canadian Transport Safety Board work to find answers, we know weather will be one of their questions. We know even though pilots are trained to deal with all kinds of scenarios, this kind of weather can add a layer of complexity to any flight. I'll be watching this investigation closely to see what we can all learn from it.